Sasvy, what did you think?
It was a very informative dialogue, and I really learned a lot about the process of how we got from modern to post, and then also the liberalism into neoliberalism, and how that kind of is how it got convoluted along the way, and that we're now in the midst of our own grip of it, or our own falling into that framework of the neoliberalism that has been dictated to us and is indoctrinated our thinking. And I'm just thinking, as we awaken, and I believe this conversation might help to kind of bring awareness to how we have been indoctrinated and how we can move out of some of these social issues that we are kind of circling in constantly.
Yeah, well, I think it's very energizing and inspiring conversation. Both Frank and Joel shared just such a breadth and depth of knowledge in terms of the historical piece with an eye on what's happening currently. And I would say my big takeaways are I love that they are both asking us to kind of challenge what we think is the norm, or kind of what is, even the idea of being that human beings are competitive by nature, that is just this thing that is. And so really taking some time for critical thinking within yourself and your beliefs, critical thinking within societal norms, and critical thinking, of course, within the capitalist structure. And the other thing is the idea of economy being so foundational to reflect and really cement what we value as a community or a society. So, and then of course I love that we ended with a shout out for just the power of being life affirming and coming from a place of love.
Mm-hmm. And being compassionate and understanding the experience of being human is the same across everybody. And how we, he was pointing to how we move away from it, but it's a heavy lift. I think we're so indoctrinated in our thinking. It's a heavy lift, but very inspiring.
Very inspiring.
Yeah.
Well, once again, we encourage everyone to subscribe to the Sasvy channel. We will continue to bring you voices from all over the country. This was a multi-time zone interview, and we are always looking for great conversation and challenging ourselves to think about things differently.
Yes, I agree.
Yes. Stay well, everyone.
Bye. All right. So welcome to Sasvy Real Raw Talk. My name is Margie Torres.
I'm Kristen Brown.
And we are here going to be talking about neoliberalism and meaningful capitalism with our two guests, Dr. Frank Gruba-McCallister, who is an author of Embracing and Disillusionment, Achieving Liberalism Through the Demystification of Suffering. And he is streaming in from Park Ridge, Illinois. And we have Dr. Joel Voss, author of The Economics of Meaning in Life, from capitalist life syndrome to meaning-oriented economy. And he's streaming in from Madeira, Portugal. So welcome both of you to Sasvy. And we'd just like to get started. If you can just provide a little bit of your background and both of you, and then you can dive into a conversation about where you'd like to get started.
Okay, well, I'm a clinical psychologist, and but I spent most of my career as a teacher and as an academic administrator. So I taught for over 33 years in professional schools in the Chicago area. And I was, in addition to being a faculty member, I also served in a variety of academic administrative posts. The highest was the Vice President of Academic Affairs at the Adler School. And while I was there, I spearheaded a revision of all the curriculum of the programs to gear students towards developing the knowledge and skills to be what we would call socially responsible practitioners. And that is reflective of my own interest and commitment to the interface of psychology with the advancement of social justice. So I have been retired for 3 years and still sort of trying to get adjusted to that, which is weird, but you know, when you're a workaholic, it takes a while to unwind. That's a little bit, so that's a little bit about me.
Fantastic. Joel.
Yes, so in the first place, I'm very glad that I can finally meet you, Frank, because we have exchanged some emails, and I really love Frank's book that he has written, very inspiring. And so, yeah, a really great opportunity to have a conversation today with you.
Thank you.
Yeah, so a little bit about my background. So I'm a psychologist and a philosopher. I'm already, the thing is, I'm originally from the Netherlands. I live and work usually in the UK, only today I happen to be in Madeira, Portugal. So most of my career, I've been looking at the existential impact of stressful life events. When these are topics like the impact of cancer, or the impact of immigration, refugees, etc. I've also been teaching a lot on courses on existential and humanistic therapies. And that's also what I'm currently mainly focused at, do a lot of research in that field. However, next to that, I always in my personal life, I've been very active in also trying to set up some social activities, social groups, even helping set up some social movements. Because for me, actually, like a lot of the values around creating a more meaning-oriented or a more meaningful economy and society, for me, that follows very logically from my ideas and I would almost say my upbringing in the existential tradition and humanistic tradition. So for me, the action and the research always goes almost hand in hand. And so that's very much what I'm currently doing, a lot that's around my community, around IMEC, International Meaning Conferences and Community, where we organize a lot of events, conferences, communities. Yeah, so that's more or less in a nutshell who I am.
Great. So how would you like to get started in talking about neoliberalism? Would you like to provide like a history for our viewers to kind of get some orientation before you get started on a certain topic?
And I think if we could just provide, both a little history and perhaps how you would define that, and then maybe also kind of leading us into how you see it presenting currently.
Okay. Well, first, let me echo, I also enjoyed your book very much too, Joel. And,
Thank you.
And we share a...
shall I possibly start on... Oh.
Go ahead. Go ahead, Joel.
There was... Okay, cool. There was an interruption of the internet there. Yeah, so shall I possibly then start with a little bit about the history? But because when I started to actually look at what is the intersection between economics and meaning in life, then of course I had to start digging into the past. So the first part of my book that I've recently published really goes into the history. And I found it actually fascinating to really see how economics is not, or actually the history of economics is not a neutral science. Because often at schools, when we possibly learn a bit about economics, often we learn a lot about all the different theories, all the different mathematical models. And often we don't really learn about the meanings and the values that are behind it. And I think it is really important to realize that, that all economics is always around values, around meaning. So when we think about a history of economics, or economic history, I would say that, it really starts already even like in the early times when people start sharing trade and in the more sharing type of communities, in the more collectivist type of societies, where it's more like also where people share products and but it's very much based on values, where like values are really crucial in the way how people make all the exchanges. But then what we see is, particularly in the more modern time, particularly at the end, the big changing points, I think 1500, 1600, around that period, where you see actually some of the biggest shifts, whereas like in the past, a lot of the economic transactions between people, they seem to be often very much around like values like equality, equity, or around communities. We see that actually becomes more abstracted. It becomes a more abstract concept, also a more abstract concept of money. And also that's also where the history of early economics really start, of the discipline, I think. But there actually there is a big difference, that suddenly the focus also becomes on money. Whereas like in the past, it was much more on like sharing products and services on the basis of values. So for instance, for Aristotle, the philosopher, the ancient Greek philosopher, for him, economics actually meant much more about like how do we deal with our household? How do we do that? How do we live together as a household? And whereas for him, that was something totally different than, I've got the Greek term for it, but about money, which for him was a different concept. And it's interesting that from 1500, 1600, suddenly those two concepts around economics and finances, money, became very much like intertwined.
So
and
what,
then,
can I interject? So what do you count that shift? Or how does that, what's the kind of the reasoning behind that?
I think that there are multiple shifts at the same time, and it is difficult to say what's the chicken and what's the egg, because what I do in my book is that I describe how in a different economic system there are different values. But when there are different values, that also create like a different economic system in such a way. So, and that like reinforces each other. It's like a circle. It reinforces. And so, for instance, what we see is, I think the biggest change is a rationalization or a functionalization of how we think about society, about people, about our interactions, also our interactions in trade. And by that, I mean that we start to think what is like the most optimal or the most efficient way of doing any transactions. Instead of thinking about what are the underlying values, the social values, or what does the other person need? And this is a relative of mine. And what will be a fair price for this person if I trade this with the person? Instead of that, we start to think more in terms of optimization. And so that is like a totally different idea around society. And I think this is also like, of course, the shift that we see with modern science, with experiments, with the more rational sciences that have evolved in that period. So that's one aspect. The other aspect as well is the materialization. So we become really focused on materialistic types of meaning, and also around hedonistic types of meaning, or even self-oriented types of meaning, instead of thinking in terms of the priority and the dominance of social values, social meanings, and ethics, justice. So we see that the values in societies started to change. But at the same time, the science has changed. Also, of course, we saw the Industrial Revolution, which was like, which gave this a big reinforcement in that sense. And this, I think, are some of the foundations of what later has become neoliberalism. And of course, that's a term that's like, we need to go a bit further in time, because neoliberalism as a term was invented in 1938 during the Walter Lippmann colloquium in Paris. And neoliberalism, more or less what that group of people was saying, it was, just bear in mind, 1938 was the period just before the Second World War. So people were feeling internationally that there were a lot of problems going on around fascism, also around some of the oppression in Russia. So what we really see is that at the time, those economists, they were saying, well, some of our values, some of the things that we have, particularly around the free trade, the free way of interaction in the economic domain, those values seem to be really undermined. And then they said, well, we need to actually ensure that people will follow our way, how we think about economics and about the ideas around free trade, about our worldviews. And then they said, instead of calling that liberalism, which was a term that philosophers have been using in the past, they call that neoliberalism. And a big difference between liberalism and neoliberalism, I personally would say, in the line of my book, I would call that difference, very much a difference that's focused around what I've been starting to call mind manipulation, or propaganda in the terms of Bernays. And so the idea was that people will not follow the values of liberal economics. People will not follow that if you don't really have a strategy to make people follow those values and types of meanings. So you need to have like a group of journalists, economists, politicians, schools, education, a full way of thinking how you educate people explicitly and implicitly in those values, in those different types of meaning. And this is very much what was more or less decided in 1938, which was followed up in 1948, 49, with Montpellier Society and many other groups that have emerged after that. And that's very much how I see the start of neoliberalism. So to summarize, I know I'm like meandering through history. To summarize how I see neoliberalism, it's very much like how we come from like the social values on which we have like an exchange in trade. Instead of that, that is like much more, becomes more functionalized, more technological, more rationalized, more focused on the materialistic optimization, and also then particularly combined with propaganda, or what I call the mind manipulation, to impose the agenda of some of the politicians and economists. That's how I would summarize it. But I don't know what you think, Frank, around that.
Well, I think a lot of what you've said, Joel, does set a proper historical context. In my book, I approach it from a very Marxist point of view, as a critique, actually, of neoliberalism. And I think, some people think of the history of thought as being divided right now into three major eras: pre-modern, modern, and what we now call postmodern. And one of the things that marks the modern era is the emergence of liberal philosophy. And there were gifts of liberalism. One of those gifts was it was anti-authoritarian, because prior to that time in the pre-modern era, the two authorities were the church and the monarchy. And they basically told people, don't think for yourself. You're nothing. We're going to think for you, and we're going to tell you what to do. And what liberalism did was first question that by saying people had the right to examine truth claims on their own and to use their own reason and their own looking at evidence to decide what is true and not true. So you are your own authority in a way. You can make those kinds of decisions. The second gift was democracy, which is the whole idea of a person did not really exist until the modern era. A person as a person who has inherent worth, inherent dignity, and should be treated as such. But like Marx said, every system has within it contradictions that over time can grow more extreme and sort of make the system break down. For example, the way that they conceived the person was as ownership, in a sense. It's like you are a piece of property and you own yourself as a piece of property. Well, the danger of that is that it's focused on having and not being. I possess something as opposed to I am, like an existential perspective, which is focused on being. That gave way to the idea that people can be possessions. And private property is more important than people's rights, right? So John Locke, for example, who's one of the great philosophers of liberalism, was involved in transatlantic slave trade and was in favor of the oppression of the lower classes in England. So it was just not that far from the idea that if we treat people as property, that now has become what we would call the commodification of people. People are commodities. Okay, they're not people anymore. And we see that in then the exploitation. So right now, the so-called essential workers, like you point out, Joel, that we call them heroes, right? As a way of papering over the fact that they're really disposable. They're low-paid, disposable people, right? And that's now validated in the fact that Jeff Bezos, for example's wealth has increased 30% since the onset of the pandemic, while 20,000 of his workers have contracted the COVID virus and are working under demeaning, exploitative conditions, right? So it's over time, what happened is that greed became okay because the idea of capitalism is growth, right? We have to keep growing. We measure success by our GDP, right? Or our GDP goes up every time there's a disaster. Our GDP goes up every time somebody has cancer, right? It has nothing to do with the quality of life. It has to do with, again, the accumulation of wealth, with having more and more and more and more. And so as time went on, I think what happened was that whatever was good about liberalism became really bastardized, you might say, by corrupt values. So neoliberalism to me is a hegemony in the Gramscian sense, which means it is the dominant ideology of our times. It is the dominant ideology of our times. And the danger of a hegemony, from Gramsci's point of view, is that it is portrayed as common sense, which is, this is not a worldview. This is not a system of beliefs. This is not a system of values. This is the way things are and has always been. This is reality. And you see, when you portray it that way, what you do is disempower resistance. Because if that's the way it's always been, or if this is the way we naturally are, okay, we're naturally competitive, we're naturally selfish, right? Well, then there's nothing you could do to change it. And also, it lifts it out of any moral context. Because if it's natural, how can we say it's wrong? You can't say it's wrong. So for me, neoliberalism is certainly part of what Joel is saying, is that we underestimate the power of economy in defining every other aspect of our lives. And that was a contribution of really Marx in many ways. Because Marx was saying the way we organize ourselves economically influences every aspect of our lives. And what it's basically done is it's created an image of the human being first that is individuals matter, okay? And society does not exist. We're not communal beings. It's every person for him or herself, right? And we see this extreme of individualism, which is contrary to what really is true about human beings. Human beings are fundamentally social beings. There's no way we would have survived if we weren't social beings. Even, and this is a skewing of Adam Smith as well, as you point out, Joel, that Adam Smith didn't talk in these crazy neoliberalistic terms. He didn't talk about human beings as being selfish. He didn't talk about demeaning people who are poor, right? But if it is in the interests of the wealthy and the powerful, okay, then that's the ideology we're going to push, right? And we're going to make it so that people are so thoroughly indoctrinated in it. It so thoroughly saturates our consciousness that it informs everything that we do, but it also thwarts the capacity of human beings to step back and reflect. And the point that I was trying to make in my book is that one of the ways that we can challenge that hegemony is by understanding the ways in which suffering, connecting with the suffering of our fellow human beings, as difficult as that may be, and as painful as that may be, is the bridge to our beginning to question what we take as common sense. So that's sort of, a bit of my spin on the way I see neoliberalism. I see it as a highly destructive hegemony. I see it as and I also see it as coming to hitting a brick wall. I think the pandemic has exposed so many of the gross inequities and contradictions of neoliberalism that people are beginning to catch on, but it's not a guarantee because we're at a fork in a road. And that fork can either lead to a more authoritarian form of neoliberalism, which is the fascist tendencies that we see, or people considering a true alternative and a more humane alternative. An alternative, I think, that Marx presented as, that we don't, a form of economy that respects the essential dignity of human beings, that sees human beings as creative, productive beings, that sees work as an opportunity for people to channel that, and most importantly, that workers need to have democracy at work. They need to control the means of production.
Yeah, I think that you've said a lot of things that are really inspiring, and that I more or less are also saying also in my book. And I would be very interested if we can also have a little bit more of a brainstorm or like a reflection on indeed that fork in the road, that place where we're now standing at. And I think a little bit later in our conversation today, we can brainstorm about that, because that's of course fascinating. But to also first have some reflections on some of the things that you've said. I think that it's very important what you were saying about how we think nowadays that certain ideas are natural, or that is common knowledge, whereas it's not. There's so many assumptions we have in our daily lives that we think it's normal to do this or that, whereas it's not. Like, for instance, the idea, like indeed in my book, I'm talking about essential workers. We have started to call them essential workers because they are the people who are currently at the front line, whereas the rest of the population can be at home because we're now confronted with the COVID-19 pandemic. And those front workers, they actually do a lot of the risky jobs, a lot of the dirty jobs. To a certain extent, yes, we're clapping for them. That's what we've done in Europe. I don't know whether you've also been doing that at the other side of the ocean, but people were clapping in public, like, we really appreciate that. They are heroes. So we've created those beautiful symbols. But at the same time, when they asked for like a salary raise, or when they asked for like the proper equipment, the government said no. And at the same time, there is not a big revolution going on of people saying, okay, is there like an inconsistency there? No, it's accepted. Okay, there's no money for that, so we can't do that. And that's the idea about what is normal, what is natural, what are the things that we accept. And I think that is very much what I was also saying around propaganda, where it's interesting that in 1938, where they came up with the term neoliberalism, that was a combination of economists, philosophers, and journalists. And it was very much also the period where they were thinking about how can we actually make people think in our way of thinking. How can we make that they start to think that this is a normal way of doing and living? And I think very much like, what you were also saying, Frank, I think that the big question is like, are individuals still meaningful in themselves? That's, I think, the biggest question, whereas like nowadays people have become commodified, to use the Marxist term. Or I used the term functionalization. By that I mean that people become like a variable in a larger function, like a statistical function that an economist or a politician has. And individual citizens have become just one number in that. And whereas actually what I'm saying is like, we should not be looking at the GDP as the outcome of society. That should not be our focus, but the focus should be much more on what I've been starting to call like a national minimum meaning. And that's about the question, to which extent can individuals who feel their potential that they have in their life, to which extent can people live a meaningful life that they have really determined themselves as far as possible. And what I'm saying in my book is also, when you go back to people like Adam Smith, actually this was the type of liberalism that they were talking about the meaningfulness of individuals in themselves. And nowadays, you see that a lot of the neoliberal economists and politicians, they have warped their interpretation of Adam Smith. And where I think it's very odd, whereas actually like that meaningfulness of the individual is that Adam Smith was talking about. That's, I think, also the utopia that Karl Marx was talking about. They're not that far apart, but it is the narrative, the bigger way how we've been taught that we start to think, yeah, these are so totally different narratives, but they are not. So I really think that in that sense, Frank, I totally agree with your ideas, and particularly also around the suffering. I think that that's the value of your book, around that the suffering can make people aware of, okay, where do those big models that and the big propaganda systems that we've grown up with, where do they hurt? Where do they not do the justice to the potential of living a meaningful life of individuals? Where does that go wrong? And I totally agree with you. It's the suffering, it's the pain. That is where you see that. And that's also the pain that you see, for instance, at the frontline workers at this moment during the COVID-19 pandemic. It's the pain also of the person who has lost their job due to the pandemic and due to all the change in the economy. It is indeed the worker for Amazon who has got COVID due to working under difficult circumstances, etc. I really think that it's a sensitivity that can make us human again and that can help us at this moment, at the fork in the road where we are, I think.
Well, I want to just reflect when I am listening to both of you. I think what keeps crossing my mind is this tension between the collective and the individual. And, you know, when we are in community, I guess in my own experience, it's much harder to ignore other, you know, the suffering or and also the joy of other people. I mean, it is the thing that connects us. And then I'm also as we're talking and thinking about how we collectively essentially adopt behaviors that can ultimately be destructive to us. And so then the need for the individual to step back and maybe be that catalyst for change. I don't know. It's kind of a fascinating tension that all of this conversation brings up as we're talking this through.
It's the fundamental tension that all human existence is lived out. I mean, this is an existential idea, like being in the world that Heidegger would talk about, that you really can't, a person can't exist from the world can't exist from the person, but it's a constantly negotiated thing. It's never a settled matter. I mean, for example, suffering has to begin with the individual, in the concrete lived experience of the individual, because if it doesn't, it's abstract, right? We've sort of created it as a construct, right? And this is something that I, as a psychologist who have worked with people who have suffered, that's a gift that I have learned from that process, is that, when people are suffering, the inclination is to say, let's fix it, right? Or let's say something to make it all okay. Well, as I write in my book, there's a certain amount of suffering that you can't fix, right? We're all going to get old. We're all going to die, right? We all make mistakes, okay? And, when I was working as a clinician, I worked with many people with medical conditions who suffered a permanent loss, right? And there was no way to make it okay, but part of them wanted it to be okay, right? A lot of times when people come into therapy, they want you to make everything okay. They've had a terrible childhood. Can you give me a different childhood? Well, sorry, that just ain't gonna happen. It begins with, you have to meet that suffering without judgment. Because when you have judgment about it, then the first response is resistance. It's like, this ought not to be, right? Or make this go away. And so the great gift that a psychologist gives to a person who's suffering is the ability to be fully present to it without judgment and say, I can't tell you something that's going to make it okay, but I can be here with you and convey a sense of presence to you and demonstrate that so that you can sit with it, so that it can speak to you in some way. But everything starts out as why me? You know, when you're suffering, it isn't why us, you know, or why you, it's why me. But it can move to why us. And because it is a universal thing, right? It is, to suffer is to be human. To be human is to suffer. We discover our shared humanity in our suffering. And then that awakens compassion. What compassion is about is that understanding that suffering is a universal. And if you suffer, I suffer. Okay? And that we then have to collectively find a way of responding to that suffering. Okay? But the suffering that we have to do, we do by collectively feeling a sense of communion, that I'm not in it alone, right? But the suffering that we've created, which is the vast majority of suffering, because of the, you know, what I would consider evil choices that people make, right? Out of greed, out of selfishness, that we also have to meet collectively. Mm. That's how social movements begin, is people say, we have a shared suffering, right? Women feel we've had a shared suffering. We've not been accepted as equal due to thousands of years of patriarchy, right? And people, Black Americans, we have a shared sense of suffering, 400 years of slavery, right? It can motivate us to also oppose those things that inflict upon where the individual does have legitimacy. And the individual still has to be seen as inherently a person of dignity and value in his or her own rights. John Rawls said, and he was one of the great philosophers of justice, he said, that is the defining characteristic of what a just society is. A just society is a society so organized that it respects the fundamental dignity and value of the lowliest person in that society.
So, just can I ask you quickly, like when I think about the feminist movement and how they're early on, and even I would argue to a certain extent currently, there is a deep divide between white feminists and women of color.
Yes.
And so is it the human condition that kind of propels us to, I guess what I see so much when I'm talking to people and out in the world and in the current political environment, social environment, is the sense that yes, they want change, but it's so narrow, and it still is so focused on what they think that they are going to lose.
Right.
And in many cases, I look at this and it's like, you don't even have this thing. Like you're afraid of losing something that you don't even have.
Right, and that those roots go back, I mean, even in the United States, for example, after the Civil War, when the early feminists like Elizabeth Cady Stanton and so on were beginning they were upset with Frederick Douglass because the African Americans were getting the vote, right, and the women weren't. Well, to some extent, of course, that's natural. However, a vast majority of that, again, is mind manipulation, propaganda. It is the divide and conquer strategy that has served the powerful throughout time. And that's where identity politics is weaponized. And that's not accidental. That is the elite, that is the powerful saying, if we can get white feminists and black feminists to fight with one another, they're not fighting with us. You see what I'm saying?
Mhm.
And so I see that as a strategy that it's called the Oppression Olympics, basically, by Charlotte Brothers, which is who's the most oppressed group, right?
Yeah.
Well, that's ridiculous. How do you even quantify, who's more oppressed? But, when identity is an important part of who people are, but identity can be exclusionary and it can be inclusionary, right? It can be embracing and it can be rejecting. And that's again, the tilt that we have to be very sensitive to, right? They don't want people to see that across these identities, they have far more in common with one another than they have with the elite.
So in the end, also what you're very much saying is the importance to recognize that suffering is a human universal, and not get stuck in that sense in an identity politics, and not only focusing on our personal subjective suffering, but to realize and to actually see that my suffering and your suffering, I can recognize it in your eyes. I can recognize it in your facial expressions of pain, of being hurt. And that's something that all of us share. And I think that's a very important point. Also, what you were saying, also how you have also worked also in practice. And as a psychotherapist, I also work a lot with clients. And for me, therapy in general is not a way to make people accepting merely the situation and say, okay, this is it, I learned to cope with my suffering and I found a way to put it to give it a nice place in my life, and that's it. No, for me, it is much more around also what you're saying is about opening different paths for people so that they have a choice, that they can make a choice. Okay, I recognize my own suffering. And where do I go from there? Am I indeed gonna sit in my home and put my suffering in a nice box and with a nice cover over it? Or am I gonna use this experience to start seeing a similar type of suffering in other people and to recognize the same suffering in the gaze that we are sharing? So in a sense, I think that psychotherapies nowadays also can be much more focused on social justice. And too often has psychotherapy, counseling, life coaching, too often has that become actually a tool for some, to use your words, of the elite or of the system, to make actually people accept and not do anything around the suffering that we as human beings are having. Mm-hmm. So in that sense, I think that psychotherapy can be a tool, for instance, to activate people. And also what you were saying, another point is around how social movements start around suffering. And also in my book, I have described that there are different ways how people can respond to this fork in the road, as you're saying. Like we can try to find meaning within the system, but we don't challenge the system. We can start fighting the system, for instance, social movements that you mentioned. Then we can also say, well, I'm just going to leave the full system for what it is, and I'm going to live somewhere totally outside of it. I'm going to start my own community. And we have people who start dreaming about utopia, something beyond. So individuals have all those different options. And in my book, I give many examples of that. And I think all of us know many examples. But when it's particularly around the social movements, so that's the option of trying to fight the system, fight the injustice that's currently going on. So I've looked at all the social movements that have been going on since like a century. And what I found is that the social movements that were the most effective were social movements that started with an existential urgency, where the suffering was number one, but not just like a suffering because I don't get enough money. No, it's around very fundamental, around like a full group in the population who gets oppressed and who barely can survive. So what you really see is that is where movements start to grow. And at the same time, also we see that social movements that focus on the social and the larger types of meanings of what really matters. These are topics around basic human rights, around climate change, topics like that. These are the topics where you see that the movement can also grow very, very quick. For instance, I've been involved quite a lot in the climate movement in the United Kingdom, and also which has now spread internationally, which is called Extinction Rebellion.
Right.
Even the title is saying that literally it's either rebel or get extinct. You see immediately there's that existential urgency. And I think that is very much when we are at this crossroads where we see where we're coming from. We see the trends of neoliberalism, of the full system going into really running towards our own extinction. Then we have only like that option, like, do we rebel or do we get extinct? And I think that's very much the importance of recognizing a suffering.
It seems like the younger generation is more, it seems that they grasp that social movement and they're more invested because it's their future. For example, the climate change and global warming, they're taking that on because they know how crucial it is to have a planet in order to be in existence. But also they're all in the United States, particularly the young are also strapped with student loan debt. And so there's a movement there. So it seems that generation is getting confronted with a lot of these movements that they have to carry, more so than the other generations before them. What are your thoughts about how the younger generation is handling this sort of movement and economy and the whole human existence?
I totally agree with you. It's also very much what I see in a lot of the social movements. We know in general that social movements are often carried by young people, but it's just my gut feeling. You see that currently really a lot. And it is indeed because of the existential urgency that's going on. It's the existential urgency of what's called generation debt, because everyone will be in debt for the rest of their lives. And we know that until now, as far as we know, like each generation gets richer and has more opportunities. This is the first generation who is actually poorer or who is worse off than their parents. So I think that is the existential urgency that calls people into action. But also the other thing is this generation is also more critical, I think, around the propaganda, the mind manipulation. And that also has to do with when you grow up in such a system, that you almost start to automatically see the limitations of it. You start to see, okay, this is Facebook, this is Twitter, and they're telling all the stories. But yeah, of course, that is not the truth. Whereas like for the older generations, they come still from a generation with an ideology of truth, justice, and the idea that, for instance, journalism is around really sharing truth and what reality. Whereas like for the younger generation, it's much more logical to see a differentiation between what certain people call news and other news.
Mhm.
And this is also where I think, where you also see that the younger generation start to also listen to themselves instead of automatically taking over the ideas of others. And that's also what I've started to call a meaning-oriented society or a meaning-oriented economy. The example I often give is, for instance, when you want to buy a loaf of bread, you can go to the supermarket. That will be the cheapest option. From a neoliberal perspective, that will be the way to go, because most likely the cheapest is the easiest. I can just simply walk in, I just put it from the shelves, I put it in my basket, I pay. I even don't need to meet any person nowadays with the self-checkout in supermarkets. So perfect, optimized, efficient. However, we see a trend currently in the economy where people start to focus much more on what's meaningful. When I go to buy a loaf of bread, I start to think, okay, who's going to get the money from my loaf of bread? I prefer to go to the local baker. I know his family. I also would like to buy a loaf of bread that I know will be good for nature. I buy a loaf of bread that's good for my body, and that's not like containing all those artificial flavors, etc., and stuff that's not good for my body. So what you start to see is that people start to let go of that functionalistic, that commodified way of looking at products, services, other people. People start to let go of that. And even the World Economic Forum, which usually is like at the forefront of what I dare to say of some neoliberal ideas, even they have acknowledged that the meaning economy is really coming up and that there is a transition. We live in a transition stage. And I think that this gives some very interesting opportunities there for the younger generations, but also I think for all of us, where we see that the economy is shifting and also under further pressure also of the COVID-19 pandemic, which makes us reflect on what is it that really matters. And it is not necessarily like having all the big amount of money. It's also about being able to connect with family and friends who I can currently not see or only via the internet. It's around also values, around, how do I think around health, looking after my neighbors who may be ill, or who I could make ill by spreading my virus or exposing them. So I really think that we are at this crossroads, at this fork in the road, as Frank said, where we are at a point where we can make some very fundamental decisions, I think. And I'm quite hopeful, but at the same time, of course, the powers that are there will try everything to move this in that direction. And even the full narrative is being hijacked. For instance, the World Economic Forum, they are currently speaking about the Great Reset. And initially, when you start looking into it, it looks great. They talk about like, let's focus on a more equal society and a green economy, etc. Values that I think looks perfect. But when you start to look at what does it really involve, what does it mean? It actually means more money going to companies that produce those type of cars, that certain services in that sector, etc. And also what you see is at this moment, some of those people like Klaus Schwab, who is one of the main people in the World Economic Forum, is also saying we should use, literally he uses the word use, we should use COVID-19 to push through our agenda of the Great Reset. We've heard that before. And it sounds all nice around the meaning-oriented topics, but then you see how is the narrative being hijacked again. And this is the fork in the road, that yes, we can start to really develop like an economy and a society where each individual matters, where our choices for buying products and services are really focused around our bigger meanings or social meaning. But at the same time, we can also be hijacked. And that's like the fork in the road, I think.
Yeah, I agree with much of what Joel has said, that that sense of existential urgency is very pivotal in getting people over a hump of bucking the system. Because again, if you think about it as a hegemony, which is this worldview that has been drummed into your head, right? That you have taken for granted as being true. Human beings do not like their worldviews being turned upside down because we equate our sense of identity with our worldview. This is part of what I call the problem of the ego. The ego is the sum total of all of our attachments. And a lot of those attachments are, this is the way things are, right? And a lot of those attachments is, this is mine, right? This is what I have right now, and I need to hold on to it for dear life, because if I don't. So having one's worldview turned upside down is terrifying. It scares the shit out of people. And because it does, people retreat from it. They say, I don't want to go there. And I think part of that is that youth difference is that, people who've lived a longer amount of time with the worldview are more wedded to it. They're saying, this is the way I believed for a long time, right? And so you're asking me to abandon something that I've guided my whole life based on this, right? With the younger person, they haven't got that long range time perspective, right? They say, well, that's how, those old people think, but that's not been my experience, right? And then we've exacerbated that by dumping on that generation. They are extremely abused. Look at how politicians treat them. They treat them with utter disregard. They demean them. They blow them off, basically, and say, we don't need to be paying attention to these people, right? And the youth say, fine, then we're not going to come out and vote for you, right? Fine, if that's the way you treat it. But they have been given a bill of goods that they've been betrayed on multiple levels, right? They were told, go to school. And this is one of the great myths, again, of our society, is that you have to be educated in order to be successful. And Michael Sandel, who just wrote The Myth of Meritocracy, which I would recommend very highly, says this is part of the problem. Because see, in a meritocracy, the meritocracy now is the reason that you're successful is because you got an education, right? And if you're not successful, it's because you were too lazy or too stupid or too something else to get an education. Well, there's two problems with that. One is people got an education, have a big debt, and didn't get the jobs that they were supposed to get. So betrayal number one. But betrayal number two is it demeans the dignity of work that people perform that they don't need a college education for, right? Which again is all these essential workers, who our lives depend on. They don't need a college education, right? They deserve to be paid in accordance with the contributions they make to society. Not because they have a high school education or a trade degree, right? So young people, their illusions have been shattered by the extremities of the neoliberal order, basically, not delivering. Now, that being said, I'm very proud of them taking a leadership role, but if we were to rely solely on them, the social movement would not work. Okay? Because social movements require solidarity. They require, again, this shared sense of suffering this shared sense of betrayal, this shared sense of being lied to and deceived. So, for example, the one demographic Trump did worse with was white working class men with high school educations, okay? Now, this goes very contrary to the stereotype that we have of Joe Sixpack, right? Which is that he's willfully ignorant, right? He's only motivated by, is this abortion stuff, or right? But see, those people were promised something by Trump and he didn't deliver, right? So they said, we're not going to vote for you. We're not going to vote for you. There's a disillusionment there. And we know that disillusionment exists because among white male working class people, there's a higher rate of suicide, there's a higher rate of drug addiction, there's a higher rate of alcoholism, because they feel like their meaning has been destroyed, right? Their meaning has been destroyed. But if we don't talk to them, if we don't reach out to them, all right, if we don't have difficult dialogues where we may not always agree, all right, but we still have to find a bridge to them. And we have to find a bridge to them where we say, is it more important to you that women not have abortions? Or is it more important to you that you are able to retire with dignity and have a pension and have health care, right? And that poses a paradox to them that shakes them up a little bit, right? And starts to reframe these issues. So when I'm encouraged because I also see in the movements that we saw in Portland across the country, movements in the United States at least, which also spread internationally, but movements in the United States that we have not seen since the anti-war movements and since the Civil War movements. It was across all these demographic groups, And when the blacks said whites to the front, the whites went to the front, right? People began to see beyond the identity issues that typically divide them. And they began to see, we're in this together because we are the 99%. And that's one of the gifts of Occupy, coming up with the idea of the 99%. We are the 99%. We are the ones who are suffering because of this obscene economic inequality. So it is, you can't just mobilize people because the people you're mobilizing are the people who are already on your side, right? You've got to go out and recruit those people. You've got to go out and say to them, come and join us, right? These are the things that we share. These are the things that we have in common, okay? And it goes back to these are the things that we're suffering from that we have in common. I believe that that's a big part of the formula. So yes, the youth are important, but the white middle class is important. The middle class is important because the idea of a white middle class is a myth, again, that was created starting with Nixon to again create divide and conquer. If you go to grocery stores, these essential workers, a lot of them are not white. They're people of color. They're working class people. They're working class people, okay? And to be working class, they have to, as Marx says, they need to develop a class consciousness. So I think it's a beginning for the youth. I have tremendous hopes for youth. I also feel personally a tremendous guilt towards them, to be personally honest, because I feel like I've let them down in some ways by handing off a world to them that they don't deserve. But I have to take that guilt and translate it into, again, solidarity. How can I find solidarity with them?
So when I listen to you, I think that the key sentence is, we are in this together. And I think that that is really so important, that we start to realize that and overcome that identity politics, and regardless of who we are and what our personal issues are. And this is what I've called the importance of focusing on some social or larger types of meaning, instead of merely focusing on individual materialistic types of meaning, or that are about me. It is that wider struggle in that sense. At the same time, it's really important that we avoid any type of paternalism, I think, particularly at this stage. And instead of saying, okay, please join us, possibly it should be the other way around, where we sit next to the people who are suffering, to those people who are quite different from me, that I sit together with them, that I sit next to them, listen to them, and that I'm there for them. Because I think that there is a big problem at this moment with a lot of the social movements, at least what I've seen in the United Kingdom, is that it's quite middle class and quite white. And even also like the Black Lives Matter movement that we've had in the United Kingdom, but I think also in the US, is that it's still not broad enough, I personally think. And I think it's so much more important that we support each other's struggles, that we stand together in our suffering. Yeah, I personally am not always the biggest fan of some of the Marxist theories around class consciousness or etc., because sometimes I feel that some of the terminology can be quite abstract. Whereas, like, particularly when you look at the early work from Karl Marx, what he's really talking about is very much the meaning of the individual, the meaningfulness of our individual suffering, and to do justice to that, and not necessarily say, okay, your pain, my pain, it's all the same, and no, to really do justice to that and really sit together with the pain of the other and really do justice. And that really goes very much beyond also the materialism that I personally think that Karl Marx was for sometimes in some of the texts, at least how it has been interpreted, sometimes too often the focus on materialism, on like, okay, we need to get like the means of mass production and only then will society become better. But how do you do that in a society where it's really difficult to really get control of the means of mass production? How do you do that? And I think that we are now at a point where actually we can actually become very effective by actually sitting together in our struggles that go beyond only the materialism. Indeed, when there is protest on the street around Black Lives Matter, that we are together in that. Or if there is climate movement, which is led by young people, that we support that. And that goes beyond the traditional ideas around social change, I think. And this is also where we need to reinvent ourselves as social movements, as people who want to create a more meaning-oriented society.
Yeah, I agree, Joel, that Marx was written at a particular time and place.
Absolutely.
And he was responding to many conditions of the time and place in which he was living. And I really look more to the humanistic dimension of Marx as a man who really believed in the importance of reversing the dehumanizing impact of capitalism on people. And I think oftentimes that whole liberation movement, I don't know if you're familiar with Paulo Freire, right? The pedagogy of the oppressed, that it begins with working with people who oftentimes have been thrown off as incapable of coming to what he would call critical consciousness. he worked with people who were peasants, and his goal was to teach them literacy in Brazil. And what he found was that when you teach people to be literate, something miraculous happens, and that is that their consciousness of their condition, their concrete lived conditions also expands because they're able to put a name to it, right? Part of literacy is, oh, that's what this is, right? Or part of literacy is, oh, this is what I'm feeling. I was trying to figure out what it is. And having a word for it is the beginning of being able to step back and reflect on it and say, well, what is it that's happening right now, right? What is happening right now? And I think that people don't have those words right now. They don't have that critical consciousness because their vocabularies have been basically dominated by the myths, by the symbols, as you call them, by the labels supplied by neoliberalism, right? So people say, oh, this is why I'm suffering, right? Because I'm not taking this medication that will cure all my ills, because they're bombarded with psychopharmaceutical commercials constantly, right? And if you take a quiz, you're going to have every disease on earth. So I never take the quizzes because I know they're going to tell me, oh, you have restless leg condition. You better talk to your physician right away. And they say, talk to your physician. But as every physician will tell you now, people don't talk, they demand. They go in and say, give me this medication, because if you don't, I'm going to go to another doctor who will, right? So neoliberalism has been very adept at situating issues inside of people and not outside of people, and then commodifying the solutions to those problems inside of people. And finally, exaggerating responsibility, which is, and if you don't do these things, the reason that you're all fucked up is because you fucked yourself up. And don't go blame anybody else about it, right? You're the one who has failed. You're the one who hasn't adjusted to market demands. You're the one who hasn't responded to the market forces that are out there telling us, the market is the new idol, let's all bow before it. So to me, it begins with, again, meeting people where they are. This is one of the fundamental principles of every social activist. Every social activist says, if you want to start a social movement, you meet people where they are. And that is, tell me about your concrete lived experience. And they might say, I don't even know how to begin. I don't even know where to start. Well, what is it? Tell me the 3 things about your job that you would like to change, if you could change. Now I could talk to you about that. That I could talk to you about. Well, I don't like this and I don't like that. And that begins the process of giving a name to something, right? Giving a name to something and educating them. And then the next step to that is, could it be different? Okay, or if you could imagine how it might be different, how might it be different? And that's like psychotherapy too, right, Joel?
Absolutely, it is. And in that sense, psychotherapy, education for me, can have a very similar aim in that sense. Although both education and psychotherapy has been very much hijacked by the system, by those bigger patterns of neoliberalism that we've been talking about. But I really like that you're so much also focusing on education, and I'm totally there with you. For instance, in the United Kingdom, we've had a minister, Keith Joseph, who was more or less the brain behind the neoliberal agenda of Margaret Thatcher. And he actually focused most of his time actually as a minister of education. And he got rid of like all those modules that are, and all the courses, all the subtopics that are more around life skills, critical thinking, sociology. And he said, we need to focus on the core curriculum. And we need to organize ourselves in a very functionalistic way, in such a way that we prepare the pupils for the economy, so that we have the best type of workers that there are. But the problem is that students, the pupils, the young people, they may know how to write. They know how to do the calculations, the maths, but they don't know how to live life or to be critical, because that's not what they've been taught. So actually, this has been a very deliberate strategy of getting into the minds of people. And I think, therefore, that also the solution also needs to come from helping people to give them a vocabulary, to be teaching. But also what you were saying is also to start seeing that it's not only me who is to blame when things fail, but sometimes actually to realize, okay, where does my responsibility end? And that's also the self-blame, or what the philosopher Michel Foucault was calling self-governmentality. So where instead of where topics that were in the past actually the responsibility of a government, actually we start to govern that ourselves. And we start to think, I have to govern myself. There's actually a lot of the topics for instance, COVID-19. So much of what's going on at this moment is where the governments are actually saying, okay, it's your responsibility to use protective equipment. It is your responsibility to be doing this. And it's your responsibility. Of course, you can go outside if you want, and you can meet people. But if anything goes wrong, it's your fault. It's like at the same time, you can also start to think, okay, what about all the resources that there are for the hospitals? We know that one of the biggest problems, at least in the United Kingdom, is a lack of beds, is a lack of preparedness. Many governments, they have deliberately ignored tens or hundreds of reports telling that we need to prepare ourselves for pandemics. But it was decided by governments, no, that we're not going to do that. And now we are in the situation that we are in a big global crisis of this pandemic, which is totally caused by the deliberate decisions of the governments to ignore all those warnings. And now we're being told that it's our fault that the pandemic is getting bigger and it's continuing to spread, because we have not been staying at home enough, or quite often, at least in the UK, quite often the media are saying that it's young people, they are partying. The young people, they are not ethical enough. But all that way of talking, it's like putting the blame onto the individual citizen. Whereas I think, of course, we need to be thinking about what's my responsibility as an individual, always, obviously. But at the same time, we also need to stop really beating ourselves up for problems that have not been caused by us, but by the system. And that is where we need to start to be outraged about. We need to be really angry and to really use that anger to really demand change, to say, okay, I really refuse that I'm being blamed for what's going on. Whereas actually we need to say it's like the wider systematic powers and the powers that are going on, they are to blame. And I really think that in that sense, it's really time for a change. And I think we can, because there is so much suffering going on at this moment, and that is calling for all this type of social movements to really evolve.
Right. I think you're picking up on some very key points. One is, again, the change in the view of government that has been spurred by neoliberalism, which is that the government is there to protect markets. The government is there to protect corporate interests. It is not there to take care of people. That has now shifted to this idea of the privatization of social services. In other words, making people, again, consumers. of social services. Like, and then first of all, the idea that healthcare is a consumer good is obscene to me. It is a fundamental human right. But if you turn it into a consumer item, then it's up to the consumer to be smart enough to know when they need to use it, to be smart enough to know whether they can afford it or not, and so on. So, and then as you say, the pandemic has exposed the short-sightedness of the focus on profit, because it's not profitable to stockpile PPE. It is not profitable to stockpile masks because they're just sitting in a warehouse, all right? So it's not this up to the moment economy that we live in, which is that you have to turn things over constantly, right? And if a hospital is not turning a profit, what do? We close it down, right? The idea of acuity, which is used in the United States, which minimum staffing of wards, right? What are the fewest number of nurses and doctors that we need to take care of patients? All driven by greed, all driven by profit, because those are, again, people who have profited in the pandemic obscenely, immorally, have been the for-profit healthcare industry, for-profit care health insurance companies in the United States. This is, as you say, exposing the cravenness, the inhumanity, the greed, the selfishness of neoliberalism in such a stark way when people are struggling to stay alive, and trillions of dollars are diverted to people who are wealthy. And their sense of trust in the government is at an all-time low. Their sense of belief that they can depend on the government to do anything is on an all-time low. And this sense of governmentality, as you talk about it, that Foucault's work, that you're the one who's supposed to, again, internalize these ideas and, take care of yourself. That's all very well and good if we're talking about little things. How am I supposed to take care of myself in a pandemic? How can I take care of myself in a massive world event? It can't be done, just like it can't be done in some sort of mass disaster, like a tornado, a flood, a hurricane. That's where government is important, But we have been given this idea that government is evil, government is terrible because they're intrusive, right? They tell you what to do. And that's then you see this bizarre stuff of, if they tell me to wear a mask, then I'm not going to wear a mask because, that's freedom. Freedom is doing what I feel like doing. I say there was an American patriot, Patrick Henry, who said, live free or die. And now that's been changed to live free and die, basically, because it's like, be free, don't wear your mask, be free, go to a restaurant. It's this really bizarre, strange contortion of the idea of freedom. Freedom without responsibility, right? Freedom without not with people, but freedom, for oneself. So I believe that these ideas are being exposed. I believe that people are beginning to see through them. But I also know that people have that tendency, when their worldviews are turned upside down, to say, whoa, hold on, this is getting a little too scary. And, part of, again, the art of promoting social movement is helping them to sit with some of that discomfort, helping them to reframe it as something that can use suffering as transformative, and most importantly, helping them to see again that an alternative is possible, a more humane alternative is possible. And what might that look like? Giving them permission to imagine.
Absolutely. Yeah. Yeah, and I also think, like, what's also important as part of that growing awareness, it's also being aware of how our own narratives, how our own imaginations, how they can be hijacked and how they are being hijacked. Also now during the COVID-19 pandemic, because there's a lot of uncertainty, because a pandemic, it's about that, it's uncertainty. We're confronted with that. But we are being told so many stories from so many sides, and politicians are saying, you need to do this is true, that is true. Whereas like it's so important that as individual citizens, we become critical also of the news and also of governments. It's not an either or story, like let's have a big government and let's just totally trust them. Now it is having that critical basic attitude and at the same time really looking at what is needed to have like a meaningful society. And this also connects very much with actually like a core concept that I mentioned in my book, and that's what I call the capitalist life syndrome. And in my next book that actually will come out now around the time that we're having this interview, that's about the psychology of COVID-19. In that book, I'm not calling it the capitalist life syndrome anymore, but I'm calling it also the COVID life syndrome. And both terms are like a variation to the Stockholm syndrome. The Stockholm syndrome, that is, let's call that like a pseudo psychological diagnosis, where individuals, when they've been taken hostage, they start to identify themselves with the hostage taker. So, for instance, they start to defend their hostage takers, and they start to identify, to say, well, actually, they're not that bad. They must have the best intentions. They're actually not that bad people. And actually, people start to see them almost as a role model. So during the Stockholm crisis, that there was this group of people who were hijacked in a bank and who were taken hostage. They were defending them afterwards. In a similar way, in our capitalist system, in our neoliberal system, a lot of people defend those neoliberal ideas. In a similar way, they've been taken hostage. And again, also now during the COVID-19 pandemic, in a similar way, we've been taken hostage by the narratives that we see on the social media, the narratives from the politicians, from the economists about what needs to be done. And I think what really starts is indeed what you're saying, Frank, is recognizing the suffering, educating people about, but also really helping people to be critical and start to see, okay, this is the narrative. This is where I've been taken hostage by the system, by the politicians, by possibly also some of the medical sciences that have been dominated by the big pharma. Mm-hmm. So I think that is really important to create a type of critical analysis and a critical awareness.
Yeah, I think what you're describing, another way that it can be thought of, in addition to the idea of governmentality that Foucault talks about, is internalized oppression, right? So the most, why do people consent to their oppression? That's counterintuitive, right? Why do people consent to their oppression? Because of internalized oppression. That the most pernicious, the most destructive form of oppression is overt. It's not blatant. It's not dramatic. It is subtle. It is insidious. It is hidden. It is deceptive because you've internalized the oppressor. And Freire talks about that as well. That in this patriarchal view, right, that the oppressed emulate the oppressor because they are seen as the ideal. They are seen as the winners. They are seen as the powerful. And people think, well, I want to be like them. I want to be just like those powerful people. So there's a kind of adhesion to their worldview. You subscribe to it and you internalize it. But so at that point, it isn't the world oppressing you anymore. It's you oppressing yourself, okay? It's you are now oppressing yourself, okay? And then that, of course, leads to all the terrible psychological consequences that go along with it. Low self-esteem, self-deprecation, nihilism, self-destruction, not really caring for oneself, helplessness, and so on. So liberation begins with that internal process. It begins with the process of finding that internal oppressor within you, okay? And realizing that it has been inculcated in you, that this is not who you were at your birth. This is not your true nature. This is not what you were made for. This is a political strategy that has been used to keep you under thumb, to keep you helpless, to keep you dominated. But I want to add one other thing I think that Freire talks about, and that is that if we stay with the dialectic of oppressor and oppressed, it is very dangerous. Because all that will happen is that you have flipped roles, right? And we've seen that historically so many times, right? People who are on the top now are and we're on the bottom, okay? And he said that the only way to prevent that is to make sure that love guides any form of individual and social transformation. And that's a big challenge. It's like the whole idea of loving your enemies, which, is pretty counterintuitive. Pretty counterintuitive. But it's an ideal. It's something like any moral imperative that you aspire to. But I agree that we have to be able, we have to hold those who oppress us accountable. We have to certainly oppose them. We have to resist them. We have to do whatever it takes to challenge them, but we can't let it be where we hate them so much that the dialectic flips. You see what I'm saying? That we find ourselves right back where we started. Because even though we are being dehumanized by the oppressor, again, as Freire points out, if you dehumanize, you also are dehumanizing yourself. So even these powerful people don't feel human. Even they, as you say, oftentimes function without a sense of very deep personal meaning. They too have been, not as much, but to some degree victimized by this very toxic ideology.
I think that this is really, really extremely important because we need to go beyond the game of power. We need to go beyond what I've called the materialistic functionalization of society. That functionalism, that is the problem. We need to start seeing each other as meaningful in ourselves. And to use a simple word, love. I think that is like a key term in that sense. And that's where I think the transitions that we're currently also seeing in society, what I call the meaning-oriented society, in other terms, to say it much simpler in terms of Freire, it is around love. Love can really break power. And I do think that that's more or less a direction where we can go to. We can. And I personally also think we must. Mm-hmm. To create a more equal society where love, the social and larger types of meanings, these are the terminology that I use, but how they really lead us in how we build society, how we deal together with our economy, with our trade. I think that these are really core questions where we go beyond the rhetoric of power, and I think that that's the direction where we can and must go.
Right. It's not enough to know what you're against. You have to also know what you're for.
Mm.
You know, and that's the distinction, I think. And also I think of it as the distinction that I used in my book, because I find Erich Fromm one of the most influential people in my thinking, where he said, you know, good and evil, the way you distinguish good and evil is good is that which is advanced, is life affirming.
Mm.
Evil is what is death affirming, you know. And so we live in a very death affirming society right now. You know, people dying unnecessarily, people doing self-destructive things. Because I think their thinking has been skewed, and because their minds have been manipulated, or because of fear, because fear makes people do stupid things. Fear is one of the biggest reasons for people being stupid, or anxiety being people stupid, because it inhibits, again, our critical thinking, right? We react, we don't think things through. But if there's going to be a revolution, it has to be a revolution that is life affirming. It has to be a revolution where we are guided by love, we're guided by compassion, because compassion and justice, in my mind, go hand in hand. You can't really have compassion without justice. You can't have justice without compassion. You know, and the only other thing I think that we have to bear in mind is patience and humility. Because, you know, we didn't get here overnight, you know, and if you're in the Titanic or a big ship, it takes a long time to turn a big ship. But every movement in the direction that we hope to go, if we can tilt it more in a life-affirming direction and away from a death-affirming direction, if we can find that point deep within each of our fellow human beings, where we can recognize our shared situation, our shared existential situation, then I believe we can begin to build that solidarity, and we could even begin to reach out to those who are oppressing us. And in some cases, I won't say all, because I'm not quite that optimistic, but in some, maybe even reach out to the better angels of their nature.
This is a great place to end. Thank you so much for this depth of material that you've presented. I thoroughly enjoyed it. Did you want to say anything, Kristen, to kind of wrap up?
Well, again, thank you so much to both of you. And yes, thank you for perfect place to end is, yes, to encourage all of us to come from a place of love and to be life affirming as we go forward, because there is much to be learned in both worldviews. So thank you again to you both.
Thank you.
Well, it's been a pleasure, and I'm so glad to have a chance to finally talk with you, Joel, and I wish you best of luck with your new book.
Thank you very much, and totally likewise. Really inspiring talking with you, and a lot of synergy there. And I also really love this full interview, this conversation that we've had, because I think precisely what you've said, Frank, around the topic of education, giving words to people, their vocabulary. And I think that that's precisely what you're doing with those conversations that you're hosting. So thank you very much for the opportunity. Thank you.